Patricia Gras, welcome to Passion Time. I'm here with the one and only Brian Scott Riedel. He is a professor in the practice of the humanities at our wonderful Rice University. He's also the assistant director of the Center for the Study of Women, Gender, and Sexuality. I have to get that right. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely.
I want to ask you, first of all, what I ask everyone, and that is, how did you find your passion, and how are you living your passion?
My passion is for the history of people who haven't always been able to speak for themselves. And I find that, particularly for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community in the United States, there's been a massive transformation of how we can speak for ourselves. In the 21st century, we have unbelievable visibility, but that wasn't always the case. And some of what's happened is that our sense of history is shaped by when we think we became visible. And what's important for me is to trace what happened before that time, because we didn't come out of nowhere. We have a past, and that past is a kind of collective memory that can fuel us for the future and our present moment. So that's why I'm passionate about history preservation and communities being able to speak for themselves.
And one of the major projects you're working on now is called Mapping Montrose, which
right.
for us in Houston is quite interesting, because that's known as the gay neighborhood. And what you found was very interesting, because it wasn't that way.
Right.
And so share with me, first of all, why you decided to do something like this, to study the mapping of Montrose and of course the gay community and where they lived. Why did you feel that was important?
Well, when I moved to Houston, Montrose was identified, as you said, as
right.
the place where you went to find gay community.
Exactly.
But as I started to meet more people who lived in Houston for longer, they started saying things like, Montrose isn't what it used to be. It's no longer the gayborhood. And people were beginning to say this in the 90s.
Wow. When,
for me, that's where all the gay bars were, that's where so many of the lesbian, gay, nonprofits were. That's where I knew that trans folks were gathering to meet each other. Okay. So it seemed to me there was a contradiction, right? The story of it's not what it used to be, and at the same time, it seemed to be still where everyone was going to find that community. So even in the 90s, there was this contradiction, and that was curious to me. And as I've stayed in Houston, that contradiction has become even more powerful. As bars have closed, the number of bars that are open today is far smaller than the number of bars that were open even in the 90s. And it's not that bars are the only indicator of gay community, and I'm using gay loosely to include everybody,
yeah.
But many people take it as a really good proxy for where is gay community and how healthy a gay community is.
Well, and also you had shared that before, that was where the gay community would gather, right? Because there weren't churches that were openly welcoming the gay community. So that was sort of where they would gather, and then eventually the bars became even political.
Right.
So share with me how the bar scene became sort of a very political scene as well for the gay community.
Well, there's multiple examples that we could talk about. A more recent one might be Mary's, right, where a lot of HIV activism came together in the 80s.
Yes.
Right, a lot of motorcycle clubs were housed there. A lot of activists would hang out there and just enjoy each other's company. But in that environment, they were also experiencing how do we handle losing so many members of our community when the government in our city and the health officials don't seem to care at all. So Mary's had a role in that way. What is now Blacksmith on Westheimer there. But you could also look further back. There was a bar owned by women in the 60s called the Roaring 60s. Rita Papa, it was her nickname, Weinstrom, and her partner, Ricky Cortez, who was a dancer, they ran this bar.
Who was not Latina, by the way.
Who was not Latina, despite her last name. That was a stage name, it's true, yeah. They created a space that was safe for women to dance with each other and for some men, but it was mostly a women's bar. And what was interesting at the time is that in the 60s, there was a cross-dressing ordinance in Houston that forbade women from wearing pants that zipped up in the front because those were men's clothes. But some women like to indicate their identities by wearing fly front pants, kind of butch identity.
Right.
So one of the things that they developed at this time was a system to warn people on the dance floor when police might raid the bar. They'd flick a switch at the front door and try to delay the policeman from entering, giving people enough time on the dance floor to stop what they were doing, drop their pants, do a 180 and pull them back up before the police got in, and that way they might not get arrested. It didn't always work. Some people did get arrested. And that was where some of the original activism in Houston began, fighting this cross-dressing ordinance. A group called the Tumblebugs came out of that. So there's an intimate connection between finding a community, the bars, and finding a political voice.
Right, right. And you also shared that there was an incident that happened in New York that sort of started the gay movement, and it had to do with those ordinances. Texas was pretty backward when it came to ordinances. It had a sodomy law until very recently, right?
2003, Lawrence versus Texas, the United States Supreme Court case that famously overturned sodomy statutes across the land, did come out of the Houston area. It's true. When you say an event in New York, Stonewall, I think is the event that you're thinking of. It's interesting because that June 1969 event is what for many people marks the beginning of gay movement. But then again, like I said before, there's many things that happened before then. The Mattachine Society brought gay men together beginning in the 50s. The Daughters of Bilitis did the same for women across the United States in the same time frame. And there were rebellions and riots at bars in California, the Black Cat, long before Stonewall. So it isn't as if it suddenly started in '69. That was just the story that became kind of the mythic moment that people refer to today.
As you were doing this research, and I'm assuming that you had to interview a lot of people and find, I guess, publications at the time, what were some of the greatest surprises that you found as you were doing the research, and you continue to do the research on the gay scene?
Yeah, this project has been going on for about 5 years, explicitly to map the bars. And part of what's interesting is that the people who might have been able to tell us about the bars in the 40s and the 50s are not necessarily with us for any number of reasons. They've aged, they've passed, we've lost them to HIV perhaps, or they're simply not in a state to be able to tell us those stories.
Right,
so very often what we have left is archival evidence. And this is where Houston is both blessed and cursed a little bit. It's hard to keep paper in a swamp, right? Which basically Houston deals with that, right?
Yes.
We are a subtropical city that deals with hurricanes, which is just bad for archiving, right? And yet, people have all sorts of things squirreled away in their attics that might tell us a little bit about what's going on. I won't say basements because people don't have basements in Houston.
No, not in Houston.
Yeah, so that's the curse. The blessing, though, is that there have been some organizations that have really helped Houston preserve its history. The Gulf Coast Archive and Museum of GLBT History is one of them. The Botts Collection is another. But unfortunately, not all of our history has been preserved by those two organizations. So to build a database of what bars actually existed, I've been happy to be able to travel to the One Institute in California, the Gerber Hart Archives in Chicago, the New York Public Library. So over this 5-year period, gathering information from multiple cities has shown what Houston's history is. So at this point,
it's amazing. You have to go outside of Houston to find the history, right?
And you find all sorts of interesting stories along the way. You find relationships that tie people between these different cities. Newspaper publishers in the 60s here in Houston, for example, a bar owner named Bob Eddy, who created a magazine called The Albatross, was friends with a guy named Bob Dameron in California. And you might recognize that name as Dameron's Guides, one of the still published gay guides for travel around the world. That started back in the 60s with a little address book that you could slip in the back of your pocket for the queer businessman on the go, where to be in what town. And so they would trade magazines back and forth.
Well, that's really fascinating. How can people learn more about your project? And also, I would like to plug your center, which brings in amazing speakers on the subjects of sexuality and gender and women. So what is the website and how can people
Sure.
find out or even help you with this project?
Sure. So the center's website is the initials of the center, cswgs.rice.edu. And you can also just Google Houston Arch. Houston Arch is a collaborative organization that has come together to bring together different history preservation projects about queer Houston
Okay.
that works to disseminate, digitize, and publicize our history.
So if they want to share their story, their own personal story, they should contact them.
Absolutely.
Brian Scott Riedel, thank you so much for being here with us on Passion Time, and also thanks for the work that you do.
Cambia tu